Jan Vermeer, Part 1. They say that Jan Vermeer painted less than 40 works in his lifetime, and yet, centuries later, the world still argues over their secrets. What if I told you that one of his paintings might contain a hidden confession? The attic smelled of old varnish and dust. Somewhere in the dim light, a square of canvas leaned against the wall, half covered by a sheet. The man who found it in 1886 described it later as the most haunting face I had ever seen, staring back at me from the shadows. That face was the girl with a pearl earring. But our story doesn't start there. It begins in Delft, the Netherlands, in October of 1632. The city was small, cobbled, alive with the sounds of merchants shouting at the canals. Somewhere above a modest inn called the Flying Fox, a child was born who would one day bend light to his will. Jan's father, Reinier, was a silk weaver turned art dealer, a man who smelled of dye and wet wool. His mother, Digna, worked the inn's kitchen, feeding sailors and strangers alike. Delft was a place where sunlight could cut like glass in the morning, and by evening the air turned heavy with the scent of river water and smoke. Jan grew up surrounded by two things: the warmth of his mother's bread and the gleam of paintings brought into his father's shop. He would stand on tiptoe to touch the gilt frames, tracing the brushstrokes with a fingertip as if trying to feel the thoughts of the artist. And from an early age he learned that art was more than beauty, it was a form of currency, a whispered message, a key to doors that would otherwise remain shut. By the time Jan was a teenager, the 30 Years' War had left scars across Europe, but Delft remained a jewel of quiet stability. Or at least it seemed so. Behind the calm streets, politics churned, and religion still split the air like an invisible blade. It was during this time that Jan began to draw, not with the wild flourish of a boy sketching for fun, but with the quiet, meticulous obsession of someone who already feared the fragility of moments. He would spend hours by a window watching how light shifted over a jug of milk, or how dust danced in a beam of afternoon sun. One day his father took him to The Hague, where the boy saw paintings by Karel Fabricius and Rembrandt for the first time. Jan didn't blink. He studied them like a cartographer studying a map to a land he had to reach. But talent was never enough. In 1652 Jan's father died, leaving the family in the art-dealing business, and debts that weighed heavier than lead. Jan was just 20. He inherited not only the business but the responsibility for his mother and sister. And in the same year he made a decision that would change everything. He married Catharina Bones. Catharina came from a wealthy, Catholic family, a fact that would both save and complicate Jan's life. Her mother, Maria Thins, was a formidable woman, rich from property in Gouda. She didn't like the struggling young painter at first. But Jan's conversion to Catholicism seemed to soften her heart. Or perhaps she saw in him something others couldn't yet see, the eye of a master. The early years were a storm. Jan's paintings sold rarely, and when they did, they went for modest sums. But something was happening in his studio on Oud Langendijk. A small, plain room with a north-facing window, always the same window, became the laboratory for a revolution in light. Neighbors whispered about his strange methods. He would paint slowly, agonizingly, sometimes working on a single canvas for months. He mixed his pigments himself, grinding lapis lazuli from Afghanistan into the richest blues Europe had ever seen. He used a camera obscura, some said, a box of mirrors and lenses, to capture the exact play of light. Whether this was true or not, Jan never confirmed. What he did confirm, in paint if not in words, was that light had a soul. And he was determined to catch it. Part 2. By 1657, Delft knew the name Vermeer but barely. He was not yet the legend of museums and coffee table books. He was a quiet man who painted very little and sold even less. The city's guild records mention him sparingly, almost like he was a shadow slipping in and out of history. Yet in his studio miracles were happening. The studio was always the same. A modest room, whitewashed walls, a tiled floor that reflected the faintest shimmer of sunlight. One window on the left, high and narrow, its glass slightly warped so that the light that entered bent and trembled like water. Here Jan staged his small dramas. A girl pouring milk from a jug, each drop frozen midstream. A woman reading a letter, her face caught between joy and dread. A musician tuning a lute while her eyes flicked toward someone outside the frame. He painted not events but moments just before they mattered. The inhale before the confession, the heartbeat before the decision. And the strangest part? Many of these faces were of the same few models. Catharina, her sisters, neighborhood girls. To Jan, their expressions were endless landscapes. But life outside the studio was tightening its grip. Money was a constant phantom in the Vermeer household. 11 children, rent, debts to pigment suppliers, Each day was a quiet battle to keep the family afloat. Katharina's mother, Maria Thins, often covered expenses, but even her wealth could not keep Jan safe from the shifting tides of the Dutch economy. Then in 1658, a fireball ripped through Delft. The Delft thunderclap, an enormous gunpowder explosion, leveled part of the city and killed over 100 people. Jan's friend and fellow painter, Karel Fabricius, was among the dead. The shock rippled through Vermeer like a wound. He began to paint slower still, as if every brushstroke was a defiance of the violence outside his door. And then a whisper began to spread among Delft's merchants, that Vermeer's works were too perfect, too still. That perhaps he wasn't painting what he saw, but what some strange device showed him. The rumor was dangerous. It was one thing to be an artist, another to be accused of trickery. Yet Jan neither confirmed nor denied the talk of the camera obscura. Instead, he closed the studio door and worked in deeper silence. What he sought now was not merely light, but the truth of light. He would spend hours staring at a jug, a bolt of fabric, the shimmer of a pearl, until the object seemed to stare back at him. But truth has a price. And in the next years, it would come for him in ways he could never have painted. Part 3. The 1660s in Delft were a paradox. For some, they were years of wealth and golden trade. For others, a slow suffocation under debt. For Vermeer, they were both, a decade of luminous masterpieces and invisible struggle. It began with her. No one knows her real name. Some think she was a servant, others a neighbor, perhaps even a figment born from Vermeer's obsession with the human gaze. What we do know is that one day she sat before him in the studio, a simple turban wrapped around her head, a single pearl at her ear. He asked her not to smile. But she did, just barely. The moment was electric. The soft gleam of the pearl, the shadows pooling under her cheekbone, the wet brightness in her eyes, Vermeer painted it as if the entire universe had been distilled into that single glance. He called it nothing more than a trony, a study of a head. But in truth he had captured something immortal. A girl who would outlive kingdoms. By now Vermeer's skill had reached a place where light was no longer just light, it was a character in the painting. It tiptoed into a room, kissed the edge of a table, caressed a jug, lingered on the curve of a wrist. His scenes became poems without words, each bathed in that left-handed glow from the studio window. Collectors in The Hague and Amsterdam began to notice. He sold a few works for good sums, enough to breathe for a while. But the more famous he became among the elite, the less the common people of Delft remembered him. He was becoming a painter for a small circle, the kind of fame that pays in whispers, not coins. Then came the invitation. In 1663, a wealthy patron, Peter van Ruijven, commissioned a series of paintings for his home. It was a blessing, and a trap. The man was demanding, precise and secretive. Rumor had it he locked certain paintings in a room only he could enter. What? No one knew. Vermeer, desperate for steady income, accepted. For years he painted for van Ruijven, pouring his genius into works that would be seen by almost no one. It was like bottling sunlight and hiding it in a cellar. Yet in the quiet hours between commissions, he returned to his own visions. A woman writing a letter while her maid waits with a knowing smile. A young girl at a virginal, her reflection shimmering faintly in the polished wood. A soldier leaning toward a laughing woman, his face lost in shadow. These were not just paintings. They were secrets, moments the world was never meant to see but somehow stumbled upon. Still, shadows were gathering. The Dutch Republic was sliding toward war with France and England. Trade faltered, prices rose, and the market for art shrank. Even wealthy patrons hesitated. And somewhere in the back of Vermeer's mind, a quiet terror began to grow. What if time forgets me? Final chapter. The winter of 1672 came like a black tide. It was called Het Rampjaar, the year of disaster. France invaded from the south, England from the sea, German forces from the east. The Dutch Republic, once the proud merchant of the world, was thrown into chaos. Trade collapsed. Wealthy patrons vanished or fled. Art, that fragile luxury, became worthless to most. For Vermeer it was the sound of the door slamming shut. The commissions stopped. Creditors came. He owed so much, to suppliers of pigments, to lenders who had financed his household, even to neighbors. His wife, Katharina, pregnant again, tried to hide her fear, but Vermeer could see it in her hands, in the way she lingered at the market stalls, counting coins twice before buying bread. The studio, once filled with the scent of oil and pigment, now felt like a tomb. Canvases leaned unfinished against the wall. His beloved ultramarine, imported from Afghanistan, sat untouched in a small jar, too precious to waste, too costly to replace. One cold morning he returned to his easel and simply stared. The light from the window still fell the same way it always had, that golden holy light, but he couldn't lift his brush. His mind was drowning in figures. Debts, deadlines, the number of mouths to feed. He whispered to Katharina one night, "I am broken. My head is clouded. I cannot paint." That winter he walked often to the river Maas. Sometimes he stood there for hours watching the ice drift past. He remembered the view of Delft he had painted years ago, the glittering roofs, the blue sky, the sunlight dancing on the water. That Delft was gone now, replaced by smoke, hunger, and fear. In December of 1675, after what Katharina later called a sudden and deadly grief, Vermeer collapsed. Whether it was a stroke, a heart attack, or simply the crushing weight of despair, no one could say. He was 43 years old. Katharina, left with 11 children and mountains of debt, petitioned the court to protect her from complete ruin. She sold some paintings, though many remained hidden in private homes, unseen for centuries. Vermeer's name faded into obscurity, his works misattributed, ignored. For almost 200 years the world forgot him. And then, in the 19th century, an art historian stumbled upon a small painting in The Hague, View of Delft. The brushwork, the light, the uncanny stillness, it was unlike anything else of its time. One by one, other works were found, reattributed, brought back into the light. Today we speak of him as a master of silence, a poet of light. But in his lifetime, Johannes Vermeer died thinking he had failed. When you stand before one of his paintings now, the girl with a pearl earring, the Milkmaid, View of Delft, you're not just looking at art. You're looking through a window he built centuries ago, a window that still catches the same light that once touched his hand. And somewhere in that quiet glow Johannes Vermeer is still painting.